Night in Medellin had a way of listening. Not quietly, attentively. The city learned to hold its breath long before the sun went down, learned to read the language of engines slowing too fast, doors closing too softly, footsteps that did not echo because they were trained not to. By the time the gate opened on that hill, the night already knew something was wrong. A single man stood there, alone. Before we begin, click the subscribe button and comment below telling us where you're watching from. And stay with us, because once this story starts, there is no way back. He was missing a shoe. His shirt was dark with blood that no longer looked fresh enough to scare anyone, only heavy enough to suggest how long he had been walking. His eyes moved like they were counting exits that didn't exist, and when the guard raised his weapon, the man didn't flinch. He had passed the point where flinching helped. He raised one hand. Slowly, deliberately, not in surrender, in recognition. If anyone had been watching from a distance, they might have mistaken him for another messenger, another expendable shadow hoping to trade information for breath. But there was something different in the way he stood there. Not proud, not defiant, just finished. "I need to speak to the boss," he said. His voice was steady in the way only exhausted things become. "Tell him it's about the men he never saw coming." The guard hesitated. Everyone did, eventually. That hesitation was how people stayed alive long enough to regret it. The man swallowed, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and added the sentence that changed the temperature of the night. "There were 62 of us." A pause. Not dramatic. Just long enough to feel intentional. "I'm the only one who came back." The gate opened. Power never announces itself. It accumulates. It settles into walls, into routines, into the confidence that comes from knowing the city bends before you ask it to. By the time this man was escorted inside, Pablo Escobar had already heard about him. Not his name. Names were useless. He had heard about the silence that followed him. Escobar stood near a window, hands behind his back, watching the city like it was a living thing he had personally trained. From this height, Medellin looked calm, almost innocent. That illusion was one of his favorite lies. "They let him in?" he asked without turning. "They didn't want to be the ones who said no," someone replied. Escobar smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It never did anymore. That was the thing about power at its peak. It didn't make you fearless. It made you suspicious of everything that wasn't afraid enough. Days earlier, in another city that understood patience better than fear, a decision had been made without raised voices or slammed doors. No shouting, no threats, just a table. Coffee growing cold. Men who had survived long enough to understand that loud plans were usually stupid plans. At the head of that table sat Gilberto Orejuela, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. He listened more than he spoke, a habit that unnerved people who needed certainty to function. Escobar had grown reckless. Everyone agreed on that part. The bombings, the headlines, the hunger for control that bled into spectacle. It was bad for business. Bad for longevity. Worse for anyone standing too close when the inevitable correction arrived. Someone suggested negotiation. Orejuela didn't react. Someone suggested waiting. Orejuela stirred his coffee. Finally, someone said the word everyone had been thinking but didn't want to own. A message. Orejuela looked up then. Not sharply. Not dramatically. Just enough to let the room know he was present. "Messages," he said calmly, "are only useful if they change behavior." No one interrupted him. Interrupting him was a mistake people made once. "Escobar doesn't listen anymore," Orejuela continued. "He hears challenges. He hears insults. He hears echoes of his own voice." A pause. "So we won't speak to him," he said. "We'll let reality speak." That was when the number was decided. Not because it was tactically sound. Not because it was necessary. Because it would be remembered. 62. Enough to look like confidence. Enough to look like overreach. Enough to ensure that whatever happened next would not be dismissed as coincidence. And then Orejuela added the part no one expected. One comes back. The room shifted. Not outwardly. Internally. Someone asked why. Orejuela didn't answer immediately. He never rushed explanations. Urgency was for men who didn't control time. Because, he said finally, fear needs a witness. The survivor, though no one called him that yet, didn't see himself as part of history when his name was selected. He was a function. A variable. Mid-level. Reliable. Quiet. The kind of man whose greatest ambition was to be unnoticed by both enemies and bosses. He believed, like many did, that loyalty was a kind of armor. He kissed his children goodbye without knowing it was the last time he would leave without measuring the weight of that moment. He told himself he would be back. Men always did. Until they didn't. The journey began without ceremony. No speeches. No music. Just engines, night air, and the unspoken understanding that every mile forward narrowed the paths backward. At first, morale held. Jokes surfaced. Cigarettes were shared. Confidence, fragile but convincing, filled the spaces silence tried to claim. 62 men could convince themselves of almost anything. But confidence is loud. Fear is patient. It waited until the road changed texture. Until radios crackled and stopped. Until someone asked a question and no one answered because everyone was listening for something else. That was when the survivor began to understand the truth he had avoided since the beginning. This wasn't a mission. It was a demonstration. Back in Medellin, Escobar finally turned from the window. "Bring him in," he said. The man was escorted forward, every step echoing too loudly in a room designed to swallow sound. He stood in front of Escobar, close enough to smell the tobacco on his clothes, close enough to feel the gravity of a man who had bent a country and now believed it was permanent. Escobar studied him the way gamblers study cards, looking not at what was shown, but at what was missing. "You're supposed to be dead," Escobar said. The man nodded. So were the others. A ripple passed through the room. Not fear. Interest. Escobar leaned forward slightly. "Why are you here?" The survivor met his eyes, and for a brief, dangerous second, something like pity flickered across his face. Not for Escobar. For the idea of certainty. "Because they wanted you to see what happens when numbers stop protecting you," he said. Silence fell again. Outside, Medellin continued breathing, unaware that something fundamental had just shifted. This wasn't the start of a war. That had already been raging. This was something worse. This was a message that had learned how to walk. Escobar did not raise his voice. He rarely did anymore. Power had trained him out of that habit, replacing volume with certainty. He circled the man slowly, like he was inspecting a flaw in a structure that should not exist. Every step was measured. Every breath intentional. The survivor remained still, not out of respect, but because movement felt like an unnecessary gamble. He had already gambled everything once and won nothing except time. Escobar stopped behind him, close enough that the man could feel the heat of his presence without seeing his face. That was deliberate too. Fear worked best when it arrived before the source was visible. "You came all this way," Escobar said calmly, "to tell me that men die?" The survivor swallowed. His throat felt raw, like it had forgotten the mechanics of speech and had to relearn them under pressure. "I came back," he said, choosing his words carefully, "because they wanted you to know how easily they disappeared." That earned him a reaction. Not anger. Not violence. A quiet, almost imperceptible smile. Escobar stepped back into view. "Everyone disappears," he said. "The difference is whether they are missed." That was the moment the survivor understood something that would stay with him longer than the scars on his body. Escobar didn't hear warnings. He catalogued insults. He didn't process fear as information. He treated it as a challenge to be dominated. Which meant the message had already landed wrong. The room around them remained silent, but not empty. Eyes watched from corners. Minds raced ahead, calculating implications, rehearsing alibis, imagining futures that no longer felt stable. The survivor sensed it instinctively. He had walked into a place where survival depended on not knowing too much and never saying it out loud. "Tell me," Escobar said, turning away again, "what exactly did they expect you to bring back?" The survivor hesitated. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because saying it out loud felt like accelerating something that might still hesitate if left unprovoked. But he had been spared for a reason, and he had learned the hard way that resisting the purpose assigned to you only prolonged the suffering. "They expected me to bring back proof," he said. "Not of strength, of restraint." Escobar laughed softly, a sound without humor. "Restraint is weakness," he said, "and weakness gets buried." The survivor nodded slowly. "That's what they're counting on." That earned him Escobar's full attention. For a brief moment, something flickered behind the boss's eyes. Not doubt. Recognition. The uncomfortable awareness that someone else had anticipated his reaction before he had time to deny it. But Escobar had built his empire on refusing to let that feeling breathe. "Take him," he said to the men standing nearby. "Feed him. Clean him up. Then we'll decide what he's worth." The survivor was led away without resistance. Resistance required energy. He was saving his for later, though he didn't yet know what later would demand of him. As the door closed behind him, Escobar returned to the window. Medellin glowed beneath him, a constellation of lives he both protected and destroyed with equal efficiency. Somewhere out there, the ripple had begun. He could feel it. And like always, his instinct was not to retreat, but to push harder. That instinct had never failed him before. The men who never came back had felt that same confidence at the beginning. The survivor remembered it clearly, not as a single moment, but as a gradual accumulation of certainty that insulated them from doubt. 62 men moved through the night with the quiet arrogance of people who believed scale itself was protection. They believed numbers bent probability. They believed reputation traveled faster than bullets. They were wrong. The first sign that something had shifted came without spectacle. No ambush. No explosion. Just absence. One vehicle failed to respond. Then another. Radios turned from tools into liabilities, crackling with static that sounded too much like breathing. Someone joked that the hills were playing tricks on them. Someone else laughed too quickly. The laughter died on its own. Fear didn't announce itself. It seeped in through gaps in attention, through the spaces between reassurances, through the growing awareness that the route they were taking felt, anticipated. The survivor remembered watching the men around him adjust their posture, their eyes scanning the darkness with a new intensity. This was the phase where confidence fought to survive by pretending vigilance had always been part of the plan. It was a lie everyone told themselves together. Then one of them didn't get back into his seat. No one said his name. Saying names made loss real, and reality was already pressing in too close. They moved on. That was the unspoken rule. Momentum felt safer than reflection. It didn't help. The next disappearance wasn't quiet. It was abrupt, violent enough to shatter the illusion that this was still unfolding on their terms. Panic tried to surface, but discipline smothered it quickly. Panic was contagious. So was denial. The survivor felt something cold settle into his chest then. Not fear. Understanding. This wasn't about killing them all. It was about dismantling the idea that they were a single unit. They were being separated psychologically long before they were separated physically. By the time half of them were gone, the mission had lost its shape. Orders felt outdated the moment they were spoken. Leadership fractured into competing instincts. Some wanted to push forward. Others wanted to vanish into the terrain and hope the night forgot them. The survivor followed because that was what he had always done. Followed plans. Followed men who spoke with confidence. Followed the belief that obedience was survival. He watched that belief die one decision at a time. When it was over, when the noise finally stopped and the silence settled heavy and complete, he found himself alone among bodies that no longer looked like people, only like evidence. He waited for death. It felt logical. It felt earned. Instead, someone stepped out of the dark and told him to leave. No explanation. No threats. just an instruction delivered with the calm certainty of someone who knew it would be obeyed. "Walk," the voice said. "And don't stop." He walked. Days later, as the survivor lay on a narrow bed in a guarded room, washed and bandaged but not comforted, he understood the final shape of the message. It wasn't about intimidation. It wasn't even about Escobar. It was about narrative. Someone had decided that the most effective weapon was not erasure, but testimony. That a single living contradiction could destabilize more than 62 martyrs ever could. Dead men became symbols. Living ones raised questions. Questions were dangerous. Elsewhere, far from the hill where Escobar watched his city, fragments of the story were already assembling themselves. A journalist noticed a pattern in hospital admissions that didn't align with reported violence. An analyst flagged a missing cluster of names that never surfaced in any official count. Whispers traveled faster than facts, and in Colombia, whispers were often closer to the truth. No one knew the survivor's name. That anonymity was both protection and threat. As long as he remained undefined, he could be anything: a warning, a lie, a liability. The men who controlled power understood this instinctively. They had built their empires on managing perception as much as territory. And now perception was slipping out of their hands. Escobar felt it in the tightening of his inner circle. In the way loyalty began to sound rehearsed. In the way silence lingered longer than it should have. He responded the only way he knew how: by demanding reassurance through control. Orejuela, miles away, received confirmation that the survivor had arrived. Not details. Not outcomes. Just confirmation that the message was moving through its final phase. He closed his eyes briefly when he heard. Not in relief. In calculation. The message had been delivered. Now it would begin to change. And somewhere between the two men who believed they commanded the future, a single survivor waited, understanding that living through history did not mean escaping it. It meant being shaped by it, bent by it, and eventually asked to pay for it in ways no one could predict. Chapter 1 did not end with resolution. It ended with imbalance. Because once a message learns how to walk, it never stops moving. By the third night after the survivor arrived, Medellin no longer felt like a city reacting to events. It felt like a body developing a fever, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Nothing had officially happened. No explosions. No announcements. No funerals large enough to make headlines. And yet, everywhere, people adjusted their routines with the precision of those who sensed danger without needing proof. Shops closed earlier. Cars avoided familiar routes. Conversations ended abruptly when unfamiliar footsteps approached. Fear, once theatrical and loud, had gone quiet. Quiet fear was always worse. Inside Escobar's world, silence multiplied. The survivor was kept alive not because anyone trusted him, but because no one knew what killing him would unleash. That uncertainty gnawed at the edges of the organization. He was moved twice in one day, blindfolded each time, not to protect him but to reassure the men moving him that they were still needed. Escobar had begun testing loyalty in small, deniable ways. Questions asked twice. Orders given without explanation. Delays introduced to see who complained. This was how empires started eating themselves. Escobar told himself he was tightening discipline. In truth, he was responding to something he refused to name, the realization that someone else had anticipated him. The idea offended him more deeply than any threat of violence. He had built his legend on being unpredictable, on forcing the world to react to him. Now reaction was coming from somewhere else, arriving ahead of him, reshaping the narrative before he could dominate it. He summoned his inner circle late one night, choosing an hour when exhaustion softened resistance. The survivor was not present, but his absence sat heavily in the room, like a chair no one wanted to acknowledge. Escobar spoke calmly about order, about vigilance, about the dangers of believing rumors. He reminded them that fear was useful only when it belonged to other people. They nodded. They always nodded. But inside, something shifted. They were no longer afraid of external enemies alone. They were afraid of proximity, of being too close to the center when the pressure finally caused a collapse. Meanwhile, the survivor lay awake in another building, staring at a ceiling he did not recognize, replaying moments he wished he could forget. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by memories that arrived without warning. He remembered faces more clearly than names. He remembered the sound of boots on gravel. He remembered the voice that told him to walk. He wondered whether that voice was still listening. No one questioned him directly yet. That was the most unsettling part. He understood interrogation. He understood pain. What he didn't understand was patience. Someone was waiting for something to ripen. He just didn't know whether it was him or the situation around him. Far from Medellin, in rooms that smelled of paper and old coffee, fragments continued to surface. A journalist, one who had learned to read absence as carefully as evidence, noticed that a cluster of men connected to Orejuela's orbit had vanished without leaving the usual residue. No bodies. No rumors of betrayal. Just a sudden thinning of a network that had previously been dense. Patterns like that did not happen accidentally. She began mapping timelines, not locations. When people stopped calling. When money stopped moving. When wives began asking questions that went unanswered. The shape that emerged was not one of chaos, but of intention. Someone had engineered a disappearance that was meant to be noticed by the right people and ignored by everyone else. The journalist didn't know about the survivor yet. She only knew that something had gone wrong in a way that didn't fit the existing script. Back in Orejuela's world, the mood was different but no less tense. Confirmation that the survivor had reached Escobar had circulated quietly. No celebration followed. There was no reason to celebrate. The message had left Orejuela's hands. Now it belonged to consequences. Orejuela understood something Escobar struggled with. Once a message was sent, control shifted. You could predict reactions, but you could not own them. The survivor was both asset and liability now, existing beyond the clean logic of planning. Orejuela's lieutenants wanted reassurance. They wanted to know whether the gamble had paid off. Orejuela offered none. He spent his days listening. Reports filtered in slowly, deliberately incomplete. Escobar was tightening his grip. Movements were being scrutinized. Lines of trust were hardening into lines of suspicion. This was expected. It was also dangerous. A wounded animal did not always collapse. Sometimes it lashed out indiscriminately. Orejuela knew the second phase of the message had begun. Back in Medellin, Escobar finally ordered the survivor brought to him again. Not for interrogation. For observation. He wanted to see whether the man had changed now that he had slept under Escobar's protection, or captivity. The distinction mattered less than the effect. They stood facing each other once more, this time in a smaller room. No windows. No audience. Just two men connected by decisions neither fully controlled anymore. "You're still alive," Escobar said, as if stating an interesting fact rather than a calculated choice. The survivor nodded. "So are you." Escobar smiled thinly. "You think that was the point?" "I think," the survivor said carefully, "that the point wasn't to kill you." Escobar's eyes narrowed slightly. "Then enlighten me." The survivor hesitated, then spoke, understanding that whatever happened next would be irreversible. "They wanted you to react," he said. "Not to them. To yourself." Silence followed. Heavy. Evaluative. Escobar leaned back, studying him. "You're assuming they understand me." "They understand what power does to men like you," the survivor replied. "It makes you louder when silence would be safer. It makes you prove things that don't need proving." For a moment, Escobar looked genuinely amused. Then the amusement vanished. "Be careful," he said softly. "Insight is not immunity." The survivor met his gaze. "Neither is denial." Escobar ended the meeting abruptly. He ordered the survivor returned to his room and doubled the guards, not because he feared escape, but because he feared influence. Words, once spoken, had a way of lingering. That night, Escobar authorized actions that felt necessary in the moment. Increased surveillance. Internal purges disguised as reassignments. Tests of loyalty that forced men to choose between silence and survival. Each decision narrowed his options further, though he did not yet see it that way. The city felt it almost immediately. Violence spiked in places that had been quiet for months. Not strategic strikes. Nervous ones. The kind that signaled loss of internal coherence. The journalist connected another dot. Fear had changed texture. It was no longer directional. Orejuela watched reports arrive and recognized the pattern with grim satisfaction. The message was working, but not cleanly. The survivor had become more than a messenger. He was now a catalyst, accelerating processes that might outrun their original intent. That was the risk Orejuela had accepted when he let one man live. By the end of the week, rumors of a ghost circulated in Medellin. A man who had walked through death and come back carrying silence instead of glory. Some said he was protected. Others said he was marked. No one agreed on what he represented, only that his existence unsettled things. The survivor heard the rumors through guards who didn't realize he was listening. He understood then that his anonymity was eroding. He was becoming a story, and stories demanded endings. He began to consider the unthinkable, that surviving the mission had only postponed the real choice he would have to make. Because messages that walk eventually decide where they stand. And Chapter 2 closed not with confrontation, but with convergence, paths bending toward one another, drawn together by fear, ego, and the unbearable weight of unfinished intent. By the time the city realized something was breaking, it was already too late to identify where the first crack had appeared. Medellin had lived for years under pressure, but pressure alone didn't destroy structures. What destroyed them was imbalance. Stress applied unevenly. Fear redirected inward. Loyalty turned into a liability. That was what the survivor felt most acutely as days blurred together inside rooms that changed but never softened. He was no longer just being guarded. He was being studied. The men around him watched not his hands or his movements, but his silences. How long he paused before answering simple questions. How his eyes reacted when names were mentioned casually, like bait tossed into still water. They were trying to measure damage. Escobar, meanwhile, had begun to feel time differently. It no longer stretched ahead of him as an open field of possibilities. It pressed against him from all sides, collapsing options, forcing decisions faster than he preferred. He responded with activity. Orders multiplied. Meetings stacked on top of one another. Movement became proof of control. But movement without direction only stirred the dust. His inner circle felt it. They spoke less freely. They arrived early and left late, hoping proximity would read as loyalty. Escobar noticed everything. The way voices dropped when he entered. The way eye contact lingered just a fraction too long. He interpreted these details not as symptoms of fear, but as evidence that fear still worked. He needed that to be true. The survivor's presence gnawed at him not because of what the man knew, but because of what he represented. A variable Escobar had not chosen. A narrative Escobar did not own. Killing him would have been easy. Too easy. Easy solutions rarely satisfied men who believed themselves exceptional. Instead, Escobar let him live and watched the consequences ripple outward. Those consequences reached Orejuela in the form of second-hand tremors. Reports filtered in through trusted channels, stripped of emotion, reduced to indicators. Erratic decisions, sudden shifts in alliances, unnecessary displays of force. The pattern was unmistakable. Escobar was tightening instead of recalibrating. Exactly as anticipated. And yet, Orejuela felt no triumph. There was a difference between winning and destabilizing. The first ended things. The second opened doors no one could fully control. The survivor had done his part by existing. Now his continued existence risked becoming unpredictable. Orejuela understood something many men in his position did not. Power was not about dominance. It was about margin. The ability to absorb shock without fracturing. Escobar's margin was shrinking, and shrinking margins made men dangerous. Back in Medellin, the survivor was finally questioned, not tortured, not threatened, but drawn into conversation. A man with soft hands and tired eyes asked him about the journey. Not details. Feelings. How it felt when the numbers began to fall. how it felt to be told to walk. The survivor answered honestly, because lies required energy he no longer had. He spoke about confusion, about the way certainty dissolved before fear fully arrived. He spoke about realizing that no one was coming to save them, because saving them had never been the point. The man listened, nodding occasionally, filing away impressions rather than facts. When the conversation ended, he thanked the survivor. That gratitude unsettled him more than threats ever could. He was being turned into something useful. Outside those walls, the journalist finally heard the rumor that anchored her investigation. A single man returned, alive. The details were vague, contradictory, almost mythic. But myths formed around absences, and she had been tracking an absence for weeks. She began asking different questions. Not who died, but who didn't. Not where violence occurred, but where it should have and didn't. Patterns tightened. Lines converged. She understood then that the story was not about a failed attack or a successful defense. It was about signaling. About power speaking to itself through intermediaries. She also understood the danger of writing it. Truth in Colombia was not something you uncovered. It was something you survived long enough to whisper. As days passed, Escobar's actions grew less strategic and more performative. He wanted visibility. He wanted reminders, both for himself and for others, that he still commanded outcomes. The problem with performances was that they required audiences, and audiences interpreted things in ways performers could not fully control. The survivor watched from the edges of this unraveling. He felt it in the tension of guards who no longer joked, in the abrupt changes of routine, in the sense that his life was being recalculated daily against variables he would never see. He began to realize the cruel irony of his survival. He had been spared not because he mattered, but because he didn't. Because his value lay in what others projected onto him. He was a mirror, and mirrors were dangerous in rooms built on illusion. One night, Escobar summoned him again. This time, the room was larger. The distance between them deliberate. Escobar spoke about loyalty, about fate, about the burden of leadership. He spoke as if delivering a lecture rather than engaging a man whose existence challenged him. "You think they used you," Escobar said finally. "But you're still here. That means you're mine now." The survivor considered his response carefully. "I think," he said, "that everyone who believes they own a witness eventually learns the same lesson." Escobar raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" "That witnesses don't belong to anyone," the survivor replied. "They belong to what comes next." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Escobar dismissed him shortly after, his expression unreadable. But something had shifted. The survivor could feel it. The margin had narrowed further. That same night, Orejuela received word that Escobar was escalating internally. The message had gone beyond destabilization. It was accelerating collapse. Orejuela faced a decision of his own now: intervene, redirect, or let gravity finish the work. He chose patience. Because patience, unlike force, left fewer fingerprints. By the end of Chapter 3, no one believed the situation could return to equilibrium. Too many lines had been crossed. Too many fears exposed. The survivor understood that his role was nearing its final shape. He would not be allowed to drift indefinitely between giants. Messages that walk are eventually forced to stop. The only question was where. The first thing to collapse was certainty. Not publicly, not in ways that made headlines, but privately, in rooms where men stopped finishing sentences because they no longer trusted where those sentences might land. Medellin did not erupt. It receded. The city learned a new posture, shoulders hunched, eyes forward, ears open. Violence still existed, but it had lost its rhythm. It came in bursts that felt reactive, poorly timed, like muscle spasms rather than deliberate strikes. That was how observers later described it, though at the time no one was looking for metaphors. They were looking for exits. Escobar felt the shift before anyone else admitted it. He felt it in the way information reached him fragmented, filtered through too many hands, softened by fear of consequence. He felt it in the hesitation that crept into voices that once spoke without calculation. He told himself this was normal. Pressure did this. Pressure revealed weakness. He believed he was refining his empire by exposing fault lines. But empires rarely survive the act of self-examination. The survivor, still alive, still unnamed, still held in that ambiguous space between protection and captivity, became the axis around which Escobar's inner world quietly rotated. Not because the man acted, but because he didn't. He waited. He observed. He said only what was necessary and never more. That restraint unsettled people who were used to panic, to bargaining, to confessions extracted under duress. Silence, when chosen rather than enforced, carried weight. Escobar began to suspect that killing the survivor would not end the message. It would confirm it. That realization arrived like an unwanted guest, unannounced and impossible to ignore. Elsewhere, the journalist reached the point every investigator eventually faces, the moment when understanding outpaces safety. She had enough now. Enough fragments. Enough corroboration from unrelated sources who did not realize they were confirming the same story. She understood the architecture of the event, the deliberate selection, the asymmetry, the survivor as narrative instrument. She also understood what publishing it would cost. Stories like this didn't just expose power. They irritated it. And irritated power responded impulsively. She delayed. Not out of cowardice, but out of calculation. Timing mattered. A story released too early became a warning shot. Released too late, it became an obituary. She needed the moment when denial collapsed under its own contradictions. That moment was approaching. Orejuela sensed it too. From a distance, he watched the turbulence escalate, not with satisfaction, but with a tightening awareness that instability created opportunities for others, not just him. The message had done what it was designed to do, but systems under stress attracted predators. The state would respond. Rivals would probe. Internal fractures would widen. Orejuela's concern was no longer Escobar's reaction. It was escalation beyond control. He convened his closest advisors quietly. No declarations. No instructions written down. He asked one question. How long could this continue before it consumed more than it corrected? No one answered immediately. That was answer enough. Back in Medellin, Escobar crossed a threshold he did not recognize as such at the time. He ordered a move that felt decisive but was fundamentally defensive. It was meant to reassert dominance, to remind everyone, friends and enemies alike, that he remained the axis around which consequences revolved. Instead, it revealed how much effort dominance now required. The operation itself was swift, loud, unmistakable. It achieved its immediate goal. But the aftermath lingered differently than expected. There was no relief. No restoration of confidence. Only a heavier silence, punctuated by the awareness that something irreversible had occurred. The survivor learned of it indirectly, through the tension in the air, through the way guards avoided eye contact afterward, through the subtle shift from monitoring him as a risk to regarding him as an omen. He understood then that the endgame had begun, not because someone had declared it, but because options were narrowing too quickly to pretend otherwise. He began to prepare himself mentally, not for escape. Escape was a fantasy, but for choice. He would be asked to do something. He didn't know what. But he knew the currency would be truth, and the price would be everything else. Escobar summoned him one final time. The room was spare. No audience. No ritual. Just two men facing the accumulated weight of decisions that could no longer be revised. Escobar looked tired in a way that wealth and power could not conceal. Not weak. Just burdened by the constant demand to prove that he still mattered more than the forces pressing against him. "You've caused a lot of noise," Escobar said quietly. "I haven't done anything," the survivor replied. "That's exactly the problem," Escobar said. They stood there, the space between them charged not with threat, but with recognition. Each understood something about the other that could not be unlearned. Escobar saw a man who had stepped outside the normal economy of fear. The survivor saw a man who no longer trusted the mechanisms that once obeyed him automatically. "I could end this," Escobar said. "Yes," the survivor agreed. "You could." "But you won't," Escobar said. "No," the survivor replied. You won't. Escobar studied him, then looked away. For the first time in a long while, he did not issue an order. He dismissed the survivor with a wave of his hand, a gesture that carried more uncertainty than authority. That night, Escobar did not sleep. Neither did the city. The journalist made her decision at dawn. The story would run. Not sensationalized. Not dramatized. Just structured, careful, undeniable. Names contextualized. Absences highlighted. The survivor mentioned only as a function, not an identity. The message framed as what it was, an inflection point in a war that had outgrown the men who believed they controlled it. The story moved faster than anyone anticipated. Faster than threats could catch it. Faster than denials could neutralize it. Once released, it spread through channels that did not require validation. It resonated because it articulated what many had already sensed, that something fundamental had broken. Escobar read it in fragments, never all at once. Each piece landed like a separate blow. Not because it revealed secrets, but because it fixed meaning. It took chaos and gave it shape. Power could survive many things. It struggled against clarity. Orejuela read it too. He recognized the closing of a loop he had opened. The message had completed its journey, not back to him, but beyond both of them. Into public consciousness. Into record. He understood then that the survivor's role was complete. The survivor felt it before anyone told him. The guard's posture changed. The routines loosened. He was moved again, this time without blindfolds. He was not informed of his destination. He was not threatened. He was simply released into a version of the world that no longer had a place prepared for him. Freedom, he realized, was not safety. It was exposure. He walked through streets that felt unfamiliar despite their familiarity. He passed people who did not know him but knew of him. He was no longer anonymous. He was a question mark walking. By the end of Chapter 4, the story had escaped its architects. Escobar's power still existed, but it had lost its illusion of inevitability. Orejuela's patience had paid off, but at the cost of predictability. The survivor remained alive, but survival had ceased to be the point. Silence followed, not the calm silence of resolution, but the heavy silence that settles after something essential has fallen and no one is ready to admit what comes next. Power had spoken, and the echo no longer belonged to anyone.